Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Al Fisher. Thank you for joining us this morning as we discuss the future of American football. The great football coach Vince Lombardi once said, "Football is not a contact sport. Dancing is a contact sport. Football is a collision sport." During the past 20 years, distinguished neuroscientists have accumulated a substantial body of evidence that the violent and repetitive collisions between players in American football and the concussions that sometimes result can have very serious and long-term and at times even ultimately fatal consequences. These include higher and earlier incidents of depression, memory loss, dementia, and a particular condition called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which Dr. Ann McKee of Boston University has said appears frequently in the brains of former football players. In 2016, there were 244 diagnosed concussions in the National Football League. A study commissioned by the NFL of former professional players between the ages of 30 and 49 found that they were 19 times as likely to have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease than comparable men that age who had not played football. And the Mayo Clinic found the CTE in the brains of 21 of the 66 men studied who had played contact sports, but no trace of it in any of the 198 men who had not. In 2012, more than 5,000 former NFL players, 1/4 of those alive at that time, filed a lawsuit against the league, claiming that it had deliberately withheld information from them about the severe physical damage to which they were susceptible. And in 2015, the players were awarded a $1 billion settlement that will supposedly cover nearly every former player for the next 65 years. After more than a decade of resistance and denial by the league that there was a problem, a stunning New York Times headline read, "NFL agrees, brain trauma in 1 in 3 players," although in this case the NFL did not acknowledge that it was at fault at all. However, only 1/10 of the claims that have been filed have yet been approved because they are tied up in a prolonged process of appeals and delays by the NFL. There have been some significant public responses to this increasing concern about the long-term physical damage associated with football. The percentage of high school boys playing football has dropped in much of the nation, except conspicuously for the South. For example, in Wisconsin and Minnesota, it dropped by 15% in the last decade. And very highly regarded professional players, both past and present, have voiced strong concerns about the impact of the game on health. Hall of Fame player and Super Bowl winning coach Mike Ditka stated that the reward is simply not worth the risk. And Chris Borland, one of the NFL's most promising rookies last year, retired in March 2017 after playing just one season because of the danger he believed it presented to his health. The NFL has made some efforts to respond to these concerns by instituting a variety of rule changes to try to reduce serious injuries. These include banning the use of the helmet as a weapon, moving kickoffs up 5 yards in an attempt to limit kick returns, and requiring that an independent neurological consultant, that is, a physician not associated with the team, examine a player on the sidelines who might have just had a concussion on the field, and then not allowing that player to go back into that day's game if, in fact, he has had a concussion. Despite these potentially hopeful developments, 76% of Americans still say that head injuries are a major problem in professional football. And yet, in the face of the increased attention given to the fact that football, in Marty's words, often wreaks devastation on brains and condemns many players to diminished brain functioning, football remains nearly as popular as ever as a spectator sport. It is the most watched sport in the U.S. by a wide margin, and when Americans are asked what their favorite sport is, 37% name football, more than triple the percentage who choose either baseball or basketball. How can we explain this apparent paradox that despite the increased evidence of football's harmful effects, a larger proportion of Americans than a decade ago, 6 in 10 today, compared with 5 in 10 10 years ago, are enthusiastic fans of the game. As former NFL star Warren Moon said to one of the game's critics, "You're probably right, but I wish you'd shut up." This morning, we hope to explore these questions with the help of a panel of knowledgeable and experienced guests. They are Dr. Megan Adams Rieck, a neuropsychologist at Unity Point Physical Medicine, Dr. Thomas Rishmann, a doctor of family medicine at Unity Point Health, and Nick Bender, director of athletic training at Coe College. First, how strong do you believe the evidence is that playing football significantly increases the probability that persons will experience serious neurological and cognitive problems? Has a causal relationship between the two been convincingly established? Are there methodological problems in the existing literature, and has this problem been exaggerated and sensationalized in your judgment?
Well, in my opinion, there's no question that this has grabbed headlines, and there has been incredible media attention and marketing push in this area. Unfortunately, I'd say the proverbial cart is before the horse.
Exactly.
In this case.
Exactly. Yes, it is definitely sensationalized. It was helped by a recent Will Smith movie, which brought that to light a little bit as well. They're again highly dramatized, and it comes down to money. So I think the ethical problems in football actually run deeper. We're seeing conflicts of interest, largely driven by money on all sides.
Yeah, I think the NFL, as you look at that as your premier league and stage for professional football players, it's the elite players make it there. In that league, it's a business. It's $1 billion business, and there's a lot of stakeholders, not only the players but the owners and the coaches in that regard as well. And sometimes, maybe the medical staff may be involved in that and may be less involved in that at times, and it's kind of hard to know. But certainly, given that it's a business, I think it does provide a lot of sensationalism and ethical issues as it relates to concussion and CTE.
But if this were a matter of money, certainly the NFL has abundant resources, financial, legal, and so forth. Why wouldn't that money be used to suppress or deny that this is a problem rather than to inflate the idea that it's a problem?
I do think there are claims that that type of suppression did initially happen, and maybe that's too loaded of a word. You could, really show that what we need to do is get the data there and really understand what's going on before making rash judgments.
I think. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, we're good.
I think it's tough too. The NFL has millions of dollars that they put forth for research, but sometimes that provides a bias for funding research that's driven by a league. So you have to be able to look through that, and you have to know, is it good research, is it clinically strong research, or is it just something they're putting money forward from to provide a statement, maybe one way or the other.
Although it's interesting to me that the NFL donated several $1 million for research at this center at Boston University, which is the source of much of the adverse research about the impact of football on physiology, on neurology. So are there particular kinds of bias that appear? Are there particular methodological limitations in what the Boston University research shows, for example?
Sure. So, speaking from what I know, the most recent article to come out of Boston University in that brain bank, Dr. Ann McKee being one of them, they had 110 of 111 brains that were donated, they found to have CTE in it. Well, there's a selection bias that they have in those brains, and that they were donated because maybe family members or that person wanted them donated, knowing at the end of their life there were behavioral changes or neurodegenerative changes in that person.
Okay. Have there been prospective studies where a cohort of football players or ex-football players are studied over time before they're known to have developed neurological problems?
Not that I'm aware of.
Oh.
And part of the problem is that you're not going to get anybody that's going to do a prospective study because the ethics of doing a study where you may intentionally inflict harm would not allow you to do that.
Okay.
So you're never going to get a prospective study that is not biased. The best we could maybe hope for is to get 100% of all football player brains examined over the next 50 years. We might get some sense of what's truly going on, but in reality, unless we can get that grand population, we're never going to see a true unbiased study.
And compare that with a sample of people who have not played football, probably.
Right. I think one of the challenges is that because this tugs at the heartstrings, there has been that leap to causality much earlier than we have data to support that. I think that there are many other factors that could be coming into play to explain the presence of these abnormal proteins in the brain, which may or may not have to do with collision sport.
What are some of those other factors that might have affected a Mike Webster besides playing football?
Well, one thing that I was interested to see recently was that individuals who have a history of opioid abuse and opioid abuse have a higher level of tau protein in the brain than people who didn't. And you could very easily consider that individuals who played contact sports for decades would have had a need for opioid medications, maybe high levels of that over the years, and that could be a factor in what they're seeing.
And it may not even be anything that complicated. Something as simple as dehydration during a practice is going to predispose towards problems. So it may be genetic. There may be some genetic predisposition. We certainly know that we're seeing worse concussions in females than we are males. So there's clearly a genetic bias.
Are the adverse or potentially adverse outcomes of playing football different at different age levels? For example, Pop Warner, I guess, would be about the youngest age group of organized tackle football. High school, college, and professional. Are there significant differences in susceptibility to physical damage by age? Are younger people more vulnerable, or are people at the professional level most vulnerable because they're biggest and fastest and their collisions are most violent?
Good question.
The answer is yes, but do we actually know what those differences are? No, at this point we really don't. And so, we do know that time and number of insults, for lack of a better term, whether they come from head ramming or whatever, but the number of insults increases the chances. Doesn't necessarily say that it's going to happen, but it does increase the chance. And as a general rule, there again, and I think the objective data is really lacking on this, you can't really quantify the severity of each one. There are some tools that are being attempted to be arranged, but as of yet, even those tools are biased.
Yeah, there are some studies where they're looking at force of those hits through technology and helmets, and there's no doubt that these are serious hits on the range of 20 to 30 Gs, even in practice in a non-concussive collision. And to give you a point of reference, that is like slamming a car into a brick wall at 35 miles an hour. And so it may not be one concussion here during the season or another one. It may be these subconcussive hits that are happening over many practices, many decades. But again, we're lacking the objective evidence to be able to make causality there.
Certainly the youth, the Pop Warner, and the adolescent, the high school player's brain is developing much differently than even a collegiate, an adult, or an NFL player. They're developing much more and much more rapidly and differently. And so you're seeing a lot of changes in that short window of years versus your 4 years in college and then maybe your extended career in the NFL. And so they're going to be, in terms of a concussion, all these individuals are going to handle those recoveries very differently. And there's been some studies over, I shouldn't say longitudinal, but over a season where they've shown that there's changes on an EEG or an MRI. They've shown some changes in that brain over just one season's worth of play, but we don't know what those changes are. Are they negative changes? I don't know that they'd be positive changes, but they're changes nonetheless.
Do they resolve? And for what types of people do they not?
Sure.
So there's just so much more research that needs to be done, and unfortunately the pace of research is slow, especially because we know that one of the main tenets of science and trying to look for truth is replicability. And one of the troubles is that most of this research is happening at Boston University among a group of people who really do have a stake in this being a syndrome, and one that really makes a name for them. Other groups, other researchers need to be able to come to these same conclusions in the same type of studies.
So, and even, if you're looking at studies, one of the things that should be done is to obtain some type of a baseline. There's a lot of talk about pre-participation testing. Even that, there's biases inherent from both the participant, because they're going to want to do poorly, so if they were ever injured, they want to keep participating, so they don't want to demonstrate any damage. There's a lot of commercial bias because of who can develop the test the fastest, and they're all very expensive, and so far they haven't really led to a lot of change as far as the management is concerned.
Right. Yeah.
Is there evidence that the recent rules changes enacted by the NFL have helped to decrease the number of serious injuries? I know I'm after 20 years as an ardent Cleveland Browns fan in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I don't follow football very closely, but I do look at it closely enough to see that just about every Monday morning there is sharp questioning of a decision by a team, and presumably by a doctor on the sidelines, to send a player back into a game. Are those rule changes, as one critic put it, merely a veneer of safety? Is there any way really to make football a reasonably safe game, or is it more or less an inherently violent game?
Good questions.
Good question, and I think we need to dissect that a little bit further. If we look at rule changes, only time is going to tell us that.
Right.
So, in 20 years, we may be able to have some semblance of an answer. In theory, what we know presently, those rule changes make sense. And, are there going to be the armchair quarterbacks on Monday morning? Absolutely. We're not going to change that. Is it an inherently dangerous game? I would argue that it's not necessarily any more inherently dangerous than other sports. If you actually look at concussions across other sports on a per participant basis, equestrian events actually outranks football.
And soccer?
And soccer is very high.
Girls cheerleading.
Cheerleading. In fact, the worst concussions that I've treated in the past 11 years have all been women, and they've all been cheerleaders.
Yeah, wrestling, ice hockey, men's and women's, are both showing epidemiologically higher incidence rates and concussions than football. Football happens to have the most active participants than in any of those sports, and some of that is due to numbers on rosters for that particular sport versus others. But per exposure, you've got equestrian, cheerleading, wrestling, ice hockey, men's and women's are all higher than football.
Bicycling.
I don't dispute that, but I should add that some of the things that I read are not just Monday morning quarterbacking. They're cases that involve, I think, the lack of precision of the means of evaluating whether someone has had a concussion in 10 minutes on the sideline rather than a day or two or a week or two. So several of the cases I've read about have involved cases where I think in good faith a sideline neurologist determined that a concussion had not occurred, only to find out that symptoms emerged later to show that someone in fact had a concussion.
Absolutely. As somebody who's on the sidelines for football and other sports, it is really my gut instinct as to whether this athlete had a concussion or not. And I think if you look at organizations like the NCAA and the Iowa High School Athletic Association, who basically have said, if there's a question at all, the athlete is out. And I think that's the predominant thing that needs to happen. We don't necessarily need to have an independent physician for NFL to evaluate that athlete. But the prudence of safety would argue that if there's even a question, that athlete is out.
But isn't it possible there's a counter dynamic, that if you have a star player who may well be hurt, you want to put him back in the game? Thinking of John Elway in a Super Bowl years
or
ago.
even this weekend, it was the Texans quarterback,
Right.
Savage, who said, get me back in there. And even last week, I guess prior to the hit, saying, I want to be on the field, because they're heading into the playoffs.
Or a coach saying, I'd rather have a disabled first stringer than a well second stringer.
Yeah,
So
it's
these are
competitive.
all issues in football from all levels, truly. And you happen to see it more at the college and NFL levels because they're so publicly visible on TV all the time. And so going back into that, I guess, original question about having all these independent neurologists and medical staffs and how are these things missed, that's a tough answer because it's maybe not a simple answer to that. It looks obvious to the layperson or to somebody watching it on TV. But being on the sideline in my setting at a D3 college NCAA institution, I'm the only athletic training provider, or maybe we have one other staff, and then at a home, we have a team physician at our home games. It's hard to see everything, and so underreporting is a huge issue, and that's been a documented issue with concussions at all levels. There's a stigma. Kids and athletes just want to keep competing. Having a concussion and playing can sometimes be seen as a badge of honor. And I think that notion is going away slowly. You're seeing more teammates step up for each other when they know something is wrong. I've seen that now at my level a little bit. But the education is also not there. A lot of our athletes are not well enough educated in the risks of concussions, even though the NCAA requires that we give them information, which we do. It's just a matter of it getting to them and them understanding it, it's sinking in and making things better going forward. But clearly there seems to be an issue with the concussion protocol at the NFL level and maybe how that's handled at times, and it's very visible right now.
This is not an empirical question, but a question about justice and fairness, of course, which is subjective. But do you think that the NFL's program of compensating players who argue that they have been physically damaged by playing, and that part of that results from a suppression of information by the NFL, is that an adequate system? Does it come close to compensating players for the lost income that they might have had the rest of their lives, or for the health care that they require for the rest of their lives? I used the example in some of the material that I sent you of a Cleveland Browns, a fellow who retired from playing for the Cleveland Browns, who has Parkinson's and who so far has not received any kind of compensation from the NFL at all, because the NFL is, value-loaded term, but dragging its feet.
Well, none of us want to see our heroes suffering, and so I do think it becomes a sticky wicket when getting down to brass tacks about who really is having an impairment, and is it related to their football service, or is it because of other factors, really makes this challenging. CTE cannot be diagnosed in a live person, and that can only be completed at autopsy, and even then there's going to be some controversy or questions about, is this CTE, or is it Parkinson's, is it Alzheimer's, and was it caused by football experience? And so it's challenging, and I don't know how they're going to sort that all out.
Concussions are diagnosed very differently than they used to be, even a decade ago. So you're talking the 90s and the early 2000s. If they had a resolution of symptoms within 15 minutes, they were allowed to return to the field. That's not the case anymore, obviously, but that's how it was treated back then. And so maybe not necessarily keeping information or providing misinformation to those players, but simply they didn't have the information that they had on concussions back then might be another alternative thought.
At least there seems to be increased concern about it as a potential problem. Like one of the main phrases I remember from my years as a football fan in the 50s and 60s is, if Deacon Jones made a particularly jarring tackle on someone, the announcer's attitude would be, he really got his bell rung on that. It was almost a spectacle of wonderment and admiration rather than cause for concern.
Sure. Or look at boxing, where the goal is to cause unconsciousness and traumatic brain injury. And so we have always, as humans, enjoyed tough sport.
My oldest nephew played football at Ohio State for Woody Hayes in the late 70s, and the Buckeyes still give an award called the Jack Tatum Best Hit of the Week Award after a particularly vicious linebacker in the 60s for Ohio State who wrote a book titled They Call Me Assassin and boasted that my best hits border on felonious assault, and who crippled Darryl Stingley for the rest of his life with a utterly unnecessary cheap tackle in an exhibition preseason game.
Well, that's the culture shift that you talked about, Nick, and it is coming, but it's slow. And some of the work we've been doing at Unity Point is in trying to educate the community about concussion, working better with schools and with youth athletics to help people better understand and work to prevent concussion. And so we can hopefully do some things differently going forward. I think that that's been some good work. It's happening also with no contact practices and with those rule changes that slowly but surely may change some of the attitudes and reduce risk.
We just have a few minutes left, and I think from the remarks you've made thus far, I have a fairly good idea how you'll respond. You've helped convince me that this issue is much more complex than it is often portrayed. I used a quotation from the journalist Dave Zirin, who's very critical of sports, saying, every new study reveals that on Sundays we are watching people become mentally and physically crippled for our entertainment. If Mr. Zirin were here with us in the studio, how might you respond to that kind of charge?
To some degree, I think he's absolutely right. But I don't know that you're going to find that in other, or not find that, I should say, in other forms of entertainment as well. It seems to be, as Megan pointed out, it's very central to a lot of our entertainment. Has been for eons.
Human nature.
And so that is part of it. I think what you have to look at as well is what lessons can be taught from football. And so you have to look at the positive sides as well.
Absolutely.
It's not a simple good versus evil. It's definitely shades of gray. You know, the idea of cooperation and discipline that comes from football or any team sport, it really does require cooperation of multiple individuals for football to, for the idea of and the goals of football to be successful.
And remembering that the vast majority of participants are going to take that good from their experience in football and not have the bad. The numbers, I think, have been very sensationalized, and what we're needing to understand better is happening for a minority of people.
Any other concluding comments?
If I were asked if I'd let my son play, I would say absolutely. But it would be his decision, not mine.
I think you know, football is definitely shown that it doesn't get, you know, it gets a bad rap. I think at times that it is certainly safer than it's ever been, but certainly there's some risk versus reward.
Okay, thank you so much for your comments today, and thank you for joining us on Ethical Perspectives on the News.